That's right. Welcome to the WDSU News Hot Seat. I'm Travers Mackle. Tonight, we're talking about the Department of Justice decision not to indict the two Baton Rouge police officers involved in the shooting death of Alton Sterling in Baton Rouge last summer. Since that happened, there were protests. There was a lot of outrage in the city of Baton Rouge. A group that kept people together and kept things peaceful was Together Baton Rouge. We now have the lead organizer of Together Baton Rouge, Brad Baggert. Thanks for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
So first off, really quickly, tell our viewers here in New Orleans that have heard about Together Baton Rouge what exactly Together Baton Rouge is.
So Together Baton Rouge is a coalition of community institutions, mostly religious congregations, civic organizations, nonprofits. Baton Rouge is a very segregated and divided place, and historically there's not been a lot of collaboration and cooperation across those lines. About 7 years ago, a group of leaders in the black community, mostly pastors, started building the beginnings of a different kind of organization that was going to cross racial lines, that spent 2 years building itself to develop enough trust to take on some hard issues, and since then works to organize people and advocate on a whole range of issues, most recently around police reform, but also has worked on public transportation, flooding issues, healthcare issues, and others. So it's been an interesting and trying time for the organization, as it's been for the whole city.
You guys were at the forefront. Your group was at the forefront of the Alton Sterling death last summer. What was your reaction? You've been very vocal since the announcement by the DOJ a few days ago. What was your reaction to the announcement that these two officers would not face any federal criminal charges?
Well, as we've learned more, our reaction has changed. There's the short term and the longer term. We are interested in the long term, in the kind of deeper processes of reform that needed to happen before Alton Sterling were shot, and those are going to be the measure of whether this community succeeds in dealing with these issues. And then you have the reality of a man who was killed by officers of a police department, and without getting that right and feeling as though there's real clarity and transparency, you can't just move on, right? After the Department of Justice released their findings 2 days ago, which was at noon, the Department of Justice held a meeting with 6 community leaders, one of whom was a representative of Together Baton Rouge, and shared a much broader and sort of more unveiled set of facts of what took place. And to now know those and struggle with, well, why wasn't more of that shared publicly, even if there was a determination of the Department of Justice not to seek charges, has us feeling like more needs to come out on this. The video needs to come out, the transcript of the video, for people to understand that there was some really significant problems that weren't discussed in the press conference that the Department of Justice did 2 days ago.
Do you think that will help the community? I know that one of the calls from Together Baton Rouge after this announcement was made was to release the body camera video and any additional video. Obviously, the federal government said it was all part of an investigation. That investigation has now been turned over to Louisiana, to Attorney General Jeff Landry, and Louisiana State Police. Are you hoping they will release that? Because in most cases, investigators don't like to give away too much information before they've made their final decision.
So it's been something that we've really looked into, and it's interesting. Sometimes the video is released, sometimes it's not. There's no law and statute that says you can't or shouldn't inside of an ongoing investigation. It's a determination made by the executives who are in charge of the documents based on their interpretation of the public interest. I think there's always a temptation when you have difficult news. And what's the news? The news is we all saw a clip of the video that started with 2 officers kind of grappling with Alton Sterling and then falling to the ground, and this very ambiguous set of events where one of them said there was a gun, but you couldn't see the gun, you couldn't see his hand, and those were the accounts that the Department of Justice laid out. Just before that video starts, one of the officers drives up in a car, gets out, and is by all accounts perfectly appropriate and in his demeanor and professional. A few seconds later, the second officer, who eventually is the officer who shoots Alton Sterling,
Blaine Salamone.
Blaine Salamone, that's right. Drive up and in the words of the Department of Justice to us, got out of the car hot. And within about 20 seconds of arriving on the scene, unholstered his gun, pointed it at the head of Alton Sterling, and said, "I'm going to shoot you," etc. Okay. Then the tasing happened, and then the altercation began. Now, it was the Department of Justice. They obviously saw it all, and we don't think they're trying to whitewash it. If they were, they wouldn't have had a meeting with 6 community leaders to lay it out. Their determination was that that wasn't sufficient to bring a civil rights charge that would carry water, and that's their call. What feels uncomfortable is that most people have one understanding of what happened, and there's this much broader story, and there are tapes and public records. I think there's an impulse to say, well, let's not let that out in case things get unruly. And I think all the lessons of history are you got to do just the opposite. If you try to hold it back, then people start to feel like the fix is in, and they start to feel like there's an attempt to cover up information. And that's why we're saying release the videos. If you can't release the videos, show them to the mayor, release a transcript, give an account of what happened, because we received a really detailed account of one side of it, the side that includes all the exculpatory information. The part that is much more ambiguous and a much more difficult call, now people in the community know, but it's not broadly enough understood. And that really is a place that doesn't feel like a comfortable place to have an open dialogue.
The federal threshold for a civil rights violation, as they pointed out a few days ago, is high. It's high to meet. We dealt with a case here in New Orleans where numerous officers were indicted after Katrina and the Danziger Bridge shooting, deprivation of rights under color of law. But the state investigation could take a different turn. They could bring numerous charges, including negligent homicide or even manslaughter. Are you hoping that some charges are filed by the state attorney general? I know the family and their attorneys are calling for it. I think one of the attorneys even used the line, this is a phenomenal case for Jeff Landry to bring charges. Obviously, that attorney for the Sterling family is representing his family. But do you think the case is strong for Jeff Landry to pursue against charges on police officers?
From what we have heard and now understand, that the level of aggression and force that this officer used, that he directly threatened the life of the person who, about a minute later, whose life he took. You know, I'm not an attorney, we're not looking at the full breadth of evidence, but if that is in fact what's on those tapes and we see all that, then it seems pretty clear that there will be a almost incontestable case for some kind of charge. Never mind a conduct that's not appropriate to a professional police officer. So, you know, I think people feel that if in fact what's on the video is what the Department of Justice told us is on the video, it'd be hard to imagine a scenario where somebody would say, no law was broken at all there. You know, increasingly that seems to be the judgment of people in the know, which is, by the way, a radical departure from what everybody assumed to be the case just a week ago when you were only looking at that part of it. That is a part of why this being public seems so important. If it so happened that the Attorney General's office does not find grounds for evidence and then the tape comes out, then we're going to have a really difficult and explosive scenario here. Because however much you know what happened, when you see it, everything's different. I forgot who the football player was, who your brother would know. I mean, right. That's right. You know, I mean, he had his penalty, and then you saw the video, and suddenly it was different, and they had to increase the penalty because seeing it is different. It has a different effect on the community, and it would be really unfortunate if this whole process of justice plays out without people seeing it, because then if, for whatever circumstances, legitimate or not, they come to a conclusion that there are not grounds for a charge, whether that's politically motivated or legally motivated, and then people see the violence with which this officer acted toward Alton Sterling, it could be a really explosive environment.
Final question here. Your group has been very involved with trying to keep the peace in Baton Rouge, telling people if you want to protest, it's perfectly legal, it's within your right, it may be even called for, but do it peacefully. This is a very divisive issue for not just the state, people in the area, but the city of Baton Rouge. There are people who look at this and say, he was a felon in possession of a firearm who was resisting arrest, which is the narrative put out by the DOJ to some extent in layman's terms. And then there are people that say, look, regardless of what was going on, did the officer need to draw his gun and shoot somebody who had a gun in his pocket? Final question, how do you all work with the community in Baton Rouge to make sure that if people are going to protest in the days or weeks ahead, that they do so peacefully and things don't get out of control? Because it was tense last summer in Baton Rouge.
No, it was, and it's tense now. And the nature of our organization is the very opposite of monolithic. I mean, we have conservatives and liberals and white congregations and black congregations and conservative blacks and liberal, the whole mix. And the biggest mistake you could make is thinking that everybody is seeing and experiencing the same thing. So the first thing we've done is just constantly had conversations with each other and with thousands of people to basically take on board each other's realities. I may not see it that way, but I want to see where you're coming from, and have called for aggressive action. A Unitarian pastor at the meeting just 2 days ago, he said, we're calling for peace but not quiet. And there was a bit of a Twitter and some discomfort. And I think what he meant by that is if there is a concern that a fundamental injustice could be taking place, then being quiet about it doesn't help the cause of peace. It in fact does just the opposite, because people feel like there's no legitimate means to express a grievance. So being a voice for peace and working together and cooperation, and a voice that we need systemic change, we need to drive it hard, and we need a police force that doesn't have federal oversight, that has had a very strong police union, that is very different. I mean, it's more like the New Orleans police force in the late 90s, where there's not been a lot of accountability, is going to involve some contestation. And I think embracing that, and taking our lumps and having people say, well, why are you asking all these hard questions? Aren't you about being together? For us, that's what it means to be together. And I think that's what's allowed us to be more of a force for peace, is people say, okay, we do see things happening. We got body cameras on every single officer that was just appropriated $2.5 million a few weeks ago. Mayor Broome instituted a wholesale change in the use of force procedures that now puts Baton Rouge in about the top 7% of the country, and it was about the top 20% before that. So the fact that we're not fast enough, but starting to see change happen and calling for it in an aggressive way, really, I think, has helped us to be more of a voice for peace and peaceful protest than things starting to spin out of control.
All right. He's Brad Baggert, lead organizer for Together Baton Rouge. We will continue to follow all of the developments going on with the DOJ's decision in the Alton Sterling matter and how the state investigation plays out. For now, I'm Travers Mackel. This is The Hot Seat. Let's send it back to you at the news.